associate. Oh, I'm going to start one more time. Welcome, everybody. My name is Christine Valenza Shin. I'm an alum of the college, class of '84, and also the Associate Dean for Beyond Barnard. And welcome back to those of you who have been attending or viewing the series all along or here and there. And welcome to anybody who's joining us this week fresh for a look at negotiating. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started. And feel free to chat questions as we go along, but I probably won't answer them until the end. So, excellent. So we're, as usual, have that little summer imagery. We're part of the summer colloquium, which is drawing to a close. And we are on our seventh of eight topics. Know your worth, negotiating the job offer. And I went ahead and put back in another nature image. It does, if it doesn't help you, it helps me sort of take a breath before we head into the topic of the day. And I should say I'm happy to be back after having a week off. Hope all of you who attended or saw the recording of the session on interviewing led by my colleague, Amanda Dye. But our topic today is negotiating. So I just have two quick questions and you can jot down these answers for yourself or you can put them into the chat and Claire will read some of them out loud so I know what you're saying. But what's your gut reaction to the term negotiation? First words that pop into mind.
Confrontation is one.
Say it again.
Confrontation.
Ah.
And it never happens. Fear and feeling undervalued.
Mm.
Also win-win. It's a more positive spin.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad that positive spin is in there. But the more negative connotations, the research backs that up, and women in particular more than men tend to have negative responses to the term negotiation, to the thought of negotiating, and a lot more anxiety around the process. Obviously, as with any gender difference, that's not absolutely, an absolute. But it is something that the research has been relatively clear on and hopefully changing some. There's been a fair amount of attention paid over the last 10 to 15 years, targeting women in particular, but it's tricky. And I think one of the things you'll see as we go throughout today that this is a nuanced topic. There's lots of contingencies and but if this and if that, so. But the second question, I'm just curious, your experience level in negotiating, however you want to characterize that, like you never have, you've tried once or twice, you regularly negotiate. And this could be about salary in particular, which is our main focus today, or it could just be, it's possible, negotiating, people use the skills generally, or sometimes it's part of your job to negotiate with vendors, for instance. Any responses there?
One person mentions that they negotiate regularly and they consult and their rate is always up for discussion.
Excellent. Yeah, that's true. When you're freelance or a consultant or a contract worker, you get more opportunities to negotiate.
Someone else is sharing that they negotiate some as part of their job and little to none personally. And then someone else says, I've always accepted the salary offered. Mm-hmm. And another, I've never had the opportunity to negotiate union positions.
Yes, that's true. And that's one of the nuances is that, one thing we'll hear sometimes from students or alumni is they will have been to a workshop or read a book or an article that says blanket statements like you should always negotiate. And, there's a good sort of impulse behind that, but it's not always the case that you have that opportunity. And so feeling that you're somehow failing for not negotiating in a non-negotiable situation is not particularly helpful either. So, all right, well, good. I'm glad to, not glad to hear that you have negative or lack of experience in it, but it sort of sets us up for some of what we're going to talk about today. So just, as a follow-up to what we just talked about, I just pulled a couple of definitions from a couple of different sources. I like the first, I always like simple. I like that first one, discussion aimed at reaching an agreement. Agreement, I don't know, I think has a positive connotation or at least a neutral connotation. The longer one here refers to a beneficial outcome, but does talk about conflict. Conflict does not necessarily mean it has to be a raging conflict. And one of the things we want to look at is that in some cases, it can be a fairly simple conversation, a fairly simple ask followed by a non-complicated answer. And then just again on the long line of opening thoughts, this was a slide I updated. When I wrote this slide last summer, we were in the moment of a lot of hiring freezes and layoffs, and so we talked particularly about how you negotiate in a really difficult job market where people were sort of hanging on to jobs or afraid of losing their jobs. So I changed the description to volatile job market. I think we've talked about that a couple times in this series, that things are volatile out there. There is a lot of opportunity, there is a lot of change going on, a lot of people leaving positions, seeking new ones. And in general, even though this isn't uniform across all fields, but a lot of employers are facing shortages of either interested or qualified workers. But I think it's starting to change, but it's really interesting listening to, just sort of following the journalism on the workforce and what's going on. The practices from basically over a decade of what we call an employer's market have not yet caught up. So some of the really, challenging things job seekers have been experiencing since the last recession, a lot of the employer behavior around not getting back to you even when you apply or even when you interview, and a sort of more apropos to today's discussion, the lack of growth in wages, the lack of willingness to pay more. It doesn't. I think there's some indications that that's beginning to change in the face of this worker shortage, but in many ways, some of these old habits, where employers really have held the upper hand for quite a while, and they are relinquishing it reluctantly. So it'll be really interesting to see how things unfold. But I do think that going to the advocacy part, the pitch for negotiating. Today, what we're going to be looking at is some best practices for, how to negotiate effectively, as well as some additional resources. And, big picture, we're still dealing with continued salary inequities. These have, even though there's lots of data on this for women, in particular women of color, and particularly in lower wage jobs. There's tons of evidence. There's been a lot of attention called to this. There's been some movement, not a ton of movement. So, looking at it more systemically is important as well. This third bullet is sort of a leftover from last year when things were so difficult, but you may still get some of that pushback from either your current employer or from a new employer that we can't guarantee a raise right now. We can't go higher right now. And so making sure, especially if this is in your current job, making sure that there's a specific plan or timetable to revisit. You don't want to continually get put off by that. It may be a very legitimate point they're making that they can't right at this moment talk about raises or can't talk about offering more, but you want to, and you may or may not go along with that. But if you do agree to, no raise or a smaller raise now, you want to think about having a specific plan. So. All right, so that's just in the way of some introductory remarks. The layout for today, I want to talk a little bit about researching salary ranges and a couple of other sort of key pieces of advice or foundational knowledge about it. And then the rest of the presentation is looking at how negotiating comes up at different phases. One of the things that has happened over the last 10 to 15 years is that salary questions can pop up much earlier in the process, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is and how to handle it, because that's sort of a different set. It can be a different set of issues and quite unsettling. People have a lot of questions around that. And then the more classic scenario of the offer is made, and now you are directly talking about salary and some ideas there. And then a little bit, as I was just referring to, future opportunities to negotiate. So whether you got, whether you're satisfied or dissatisfied with where you ended up with in your negotiation of the job offer, what can you do going forward to continue to visit the topic on a regular basis? So, all right, so a couple of key points. I titled this Know Your Worth and what is your worth? At least in the context of your worth is many things, but in the context of salary negotiation, it's the market rate plus your skills and experience. That's what adds up to your worth. Let's break this down a little bit. So what the market rate means is you are looking at positions, similar positions at this particular company or similar companies or within the industry. And then location is very important. That can, really vary from place to place. And of course, remote work can throw an interesting variation into all of that as well. So it can make that a little bit more complicated. But basically, this is one of the key things and why research is so important, is to get an understanding of what the market rate is. And then the part about your worth is getting a sense of your skill and experience levels and how that compares objectively to the job description and also to others in the job. Not all of these things are always readily apparent, but this is the basic formula: is you want external information about how this job, this position fits into the market generally, and then you want to look at your skills and experiences, which are not always easy to quantify. So that's again one of the areas of nuance in this topic. So I want to give you both some online and in-person resources. There are a lot of salary finders on the internet, and it's not a bad place to start, but we'll talk about a few caveats after I give you the list. So one of the first ventures in this is Glassdoor.com, which shares information about salary, interview questions, work satisfaction in general. There are a couple that are specific to salaries. They have different ways of approaching. I think it's PayScale, where you put in a lot of information, like where you're looking and the title and your experience, and then it comes up with things. So they approach it different ways. And then a lot of the big job sites have introduced their own salary finders as well. So Indeed.com is one of the biggest general. And then LinkedIn Salary Insights is interesting. I think if you agree to share your current salary, you get a free year of Salary Insights. And then I think after that, you have to pay for it. I didn't look at the ticket price at this point, but it could be interesting if you are, I would wait until you launch your actual job search to do that, but it might, if you're willing to share that information, anonymously, at least in the aggregate, then that could be a good tool to use. So in the nonprofit sector, there's a couple of key sites and reports that can be helpful. There's something called the PNP Staffing Group. I think the PNP originally it's Professionals for Nonprofits. It's sort of a general site, but they do an annual salary report. It is, I forgot, it comes out in March, and I did not circle back and double check on this, but last time I checked, there was one for New York, Washington, and Philadelphia. So it's got sort of a northeastern city bias. They might have added additional cities since then, but you might take a look at that. And then if you, so that's they look at salaries by title and then within the size of the nonprofit organization. And so then if you are looking at a specific nonprofit, once you've looked at the PNP Staffing Group salary report, you can then go to guidestar.com, which is where nonprofits have to publish their budgets and their sort of top line salaries. And so that can give you a sense of where does this particular nonprofit fit into the landscape, and then you can use the information from the salary report. So it's a little bit of, you have to dig a little, but it's pretty reliable information, so that can be helpful if you're looking in the nonprofit. Another great source is professional associations and trade groups, many of whom do their own salary surveys. So we, for instance, there's lots of things that cover the work we do, but one of the biggest ones is NACE. which is the National Association of Colleges and Employers. So it's sort of looking at that interface. They do every year they do a salary survey of the most recent graduating class. So if you're sort of at, in a fairly recent graduate or alum, that can be helpful, but then they do other salary surveys as well. So if you belong to a professional association that covers your field, or you can always, even if you don't belong, you can look and see if any of that information is out. And then job boards themselves, a lot of jobs don't post salary information, but some do. So that can be helpful sort of for comparison's sake. And then for government salaries, those do have to be public. But even if you're not looking within the government sector, which many of you would not be, you can use it for comparison. So for instance, if you were, applying to be if you're looking at a data analyst position in a private or nonprofit sector company or organization, you could see what the government is paying for comparison. I'd say, as a very broad generalization, the government's going to pay less than the private sector and equal to or possibly slightly above the nonprofit sector, which is huge. So that's why it's very much a broad generalization, but sometimes it can be useful to see. There's a little bit of, sort of detective work and piecing together, pieces of information here. But this should give you a place to at least get some general sense of as we talked about, the market rate. But you also want to talk to people, all right? And so whether it's your current field that you're exploring or a new field, talking to people, if you're networking with them, if you have an informational interview, it might not want to be your lead question, but you definitely towards the end of a conversation, especially if you've been talking about specific roles that might be a good fit for you, just giving you a script, some language for asking. There's a lot of discomfort, both individually and culturally, I would say, in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere, around talking about money. So it can feel uncomfortable. So it's not, and the advice is not to ask people directly, how much do you make? Although there are plenty of people who will offer that and who are comfortable saying that, but lots of people who aren't. But these are just some scripts of a couple ways you can bring it up, and often if you ask about it in a general way, people are more comfortable talking about it. If somebody's super uncomfortable about it or feels like they don't have a lot of knowledge, it's fine to then back off of it. But one of the things we encourage, one of the skill sets around negotiating is to talk about money more upfront in general, and to get more comfortable and to sort of seek, sort of look for people who are comfortable talking about money and salary. That can be a helpful change in the culture, and helpful for you personally in terms of figuring out all of this stuff. Recruiters can be a great source of information on this, since they are in the thick of this. The individual recruiter you're working with they may or may not be forthcoming. Again, one thing we've talked about with recruiters is they are working for the organization that's doing the hiring. So they may not be able to be 100% transparent. But if you get the opportunity to connect with a recruiter in the field, not around a specific job, but just, have the opportunity, they can give you some general information. So that can be worth a shot. And then connections at a specific company or organization, somebody who currently works there, who's worked there recently. If you can network with them, connect with them. Again, you don't want to reach out for the first time to talk salary per se, but if you've already made a connection on LinkedIn or had an opportunity to chat online or in person, you could definitely circle back or ask them as one of several questions, right? And depending on the industry, how small it is or how insular it is, people in general, a lot of companies, organizations have reputations for paying about the same as everyone else, a little better, a little worse, so you can definitely, again, seek that information. And you're not, just a reminder, you're not always looking for a single definitive figure. You're looking for patterns and sort of general information to help ground you as you head into this. This is a suggestion mainly for myself and others like me. I tend to have trouble. I just have more trouble remembering numbers in all sorts of contexts than I do other things. So keep a record of what you find out, even if it's informal or anecdotal, spreadsheet, a document, anything, file. But just keep, as you talk to individual people, and again, look for those patterns. So. Okay, and then I just wanted to say, we're going to talk more specifically about naming a number at different points and in different contexts, but I decided to move this slide up earlier in the presentation to just give a general, after you do all of this research and you have a pretty good sense, what do you do? And so there's sort of three contingencies here. If you feel like you've got pretty good, consistent, valuable, trustable information about the range being what range might be offered, you should name a number at the top or above the range, and we'll talk more about how you then back that up. If you're a little less certain, you could go for a number in the middle and then kind of read the room as the bullets point out. And then if you're absolutely uncertain, you have no idea, you haven't been able to dig up any information, or you're asked sort of on the fly, you could work cautiously from your salary. The reason I say cautiously, this is actually one of the reasons for the historical underpayment of women and people of color and other historically marginalized groups within the workforce, that for a long time, the employer behavior was to ask what was your former salary and then sort of build from that. And so if you had a very low salary early on, for whatever reason, then you continue to build on that low salary as opposed to a higher salary. And that's why we really want to break that pattern of working from your current salary and instead thinking about it in terms of the actual role you're applying to and what's the market rate there. But if you have no idea where to start, you could certainly use your current salary and just make sure you ask for more, and then see how things go from there. But this is just a general approach. As I said, we're going to get into more specifics of how this can work. So just want to make sure I'm doing well on time. So one overlooked part of this, and it's sort of an undercurrent of what I've been saying, is we've got just this really weird culture around negotiating in the United States, which is that for some reason, many employers leave it up to the job seeker to say the number first. And sometimes, I think this is changing a little bit. Some places are being more forthcoming, but the reason why I say it's sort of nuts is that, the company or organization, they know their range, they know what they've got in the budget, they actually probably have a lot more information about what the market rate is, for what they pay for various roles and what some of their competitors or fellow organizations do. And for some reason, it's just become the norm that they don't share that. There are obviously exceptions to that. So it's always worth remembering that before you do anything, put the question back on them. So at whatever point you're asked about what you're looking for, try and flip it back politely, nicely. What is the usual salary for this position? Or what are you offering for this position? So that's just, it can circumvent this whole process if you just ask them directly. And sometimes they answer and sometimes they don't, and you can sort of take it from there. Another key general negotiating principle is for you individually to have worked out, what is the lowest acceptable salary to you, so that you know that if they go that low, that you would have to walk away for either practical purposes or it could be practical that there's no way you could live on that, or no way or it could be back on this concept of worth. There's no way you're going to accept an offer that is so far below what your skills and experience demand. So, but as I said, nuance. You need to stay flexible and sort of use your best judgment throughout this, but also reach out to us. There's a lot of different resources. I'll talk about them at the end, but we are here, and this is definitely, a big part of what we do, both for our graduating seniors as they enter and sort of encounter this for the first time, but also for alumni. And it's on the short list of things you can reach out to us directly, because it's very often time sensitive. So I just had an appointment yesterday talking about not so much a short term, but a sort of long-term salary strategy for somebody whose company is very much trying to get her to stay and sort of looking ahead a year or two. And then at the same time, I had I think an email exchange a couple weeks ago with an alum that I had met with previously, who said, "Hey, they're offering this. What should I say?" So we're definitely here to help you through the process, either in advance or in the moment. So, okay. All right, so then let's go to our timeline. A couple points about answering salary questions early in the process, right? So one general, so as I said, it's become fairly common to ask, sometimes in the online application, or sometimes they'll say in the job description to put it into your cover letter what your salary needs. I think one key thing is, so one general principle here is to try not to, try and get out of naming that number early in the process. Early on, you don't have a lot of clout. You are one of many applicants potentially, even if maybe you came in as a referral. So you want to wait until you're in the position of them actually offering you the job, which gives you a little bit more leverage. But if you can't get around it, if you're dealing with a form where you actually have to put a number in or a range, you can enter that, make your best guess based on your research. And I think the key thing that I think a lot of people forget is, or a lot of people worry about, is that just because you name a number earlier in the process, it's not usually the first round in negotiating. It could be. You could get somebody at the end of the process saying, but when you put in 75,000 in your application, but that's rare, and you should be, it's relatively easy to say, yeah, now that I know more about the job and, sort of have done a little bit more research, I feel that, this is the better number, so there's definitely ways we can revisit that. And in general, again, going back to this issue of not naming your current salary and not basing your negotiation off your current salary. Quite a few states have made it illegal for employers to ask about this, specifically because of the disparities for a lot of people. Of course, a few cities, and I don't think anybody at the state level, but a few cities have, or maybe some states have made it illegal to make it illegal for potential employers. That's the current polarized system we live in at this point. So there's been some pushback against that, in other words, but the general tide has been to try and protect people from that particular bias. So at any point during, so very often, like in the initial application, in the cover letter or in an online form, this is more about screening than it is about the actual negotiating, right? So, the key here is, the bottom line is sort of down at the bottom of the slide. The idea is to keep your options open until the final negotiation, when you've actually been offered the job. So if you're in an actual interview, in an actual dialogue, this is where you get to ask that question, what range they have in mind. You can then name a range, and then just keep adding that you're flexible. So this is if it comes up before you've been offered the job. And same thing if they actually move into, trying to negotiate early on with you before they've actually offered. You want to push back against that if possible. If they really press hard, you can name a range, but add that you're flexible. People, employers trying to negotiate before they've offered you the job, I'd say it's a little bit of a red flag. It doesn't mean you absolutely don't, but really aggressive pushing on this early in the process can be a sign. It's a little bit out of the norm and could be a sign that it's not necessarily a great place to work. So all right, so yeah, so again, basic idea is to keep your options open, and indicate that you're flexible, that you've done some research, that you are flexible, and that you're happy to talk about the details later on in the process. So now when we do get to later on in the process and an offer has actually been made, right? So here's where the power shift. Doesn't always feel like that, but this is why I have a couple of these points to reassure you that they've gone through this long process. They've picked you. You are their top choice. You are the person they are offering the job to. Even if you're their second choice and they've already offered to somebody else and that person's turned them down, now you're the top choice. I can't say that an offer can ever be withdrawn just because you try and negotiate. There are stories out there of that, but it's exceedingly rare. And when it does happen, that is a big red flag. If somebody withdraws an offer just because you ask about negotiating, or just because you ask about there being some flexibility, that's a big sign. If they're uncomfortable with that it's upsetting, but it's you've sort of saved yourself probably from working for a not great place. Negotiation is normal in many industries, not all industries. And not everybody's comfortable. Certainly a lot of job seekers aren't comfortable with it, but keep in mind that people on the other side are not always comfortable with it or great at it as well. So don't assume that every employer out there is a negotiating professional with a strategy and you know, an agenda. You know, very often they are not particularly comfortable with or particularly experienced, or maybe just don't do it well. So something to keep in mind. I was working with an alum who was applying in higher ed, and the person she was negotiating with said basically the equivalent of, I think it was a position, it was a high up position, you know, like in the college president's office or something. And the person actually told her, oh, our budget is set differently. We can pay a lot more than other departments. So, you know, not a great negotiating tactic. She basically gave away the fact that they had flexibility and she should go higher. And the alum brought that back to me and we adjusted her ask up and she got it. So, you know, just as an example, a happy ending example. So, but here's where the nuance comes in. It is quite true that many jobs have set salary ranges and there's not a lot of room. I would say this is particularly true of entry level positions, you know, for recent grads, very often, sometimes there's literally no room, you know, even some of the more higher paying positions, you know, like the big finance and big consulting, when they bring in a cohort of recent graduates, those salaries are very often, you know, set and there's not wiggle room. It is what it is. Another example would be in the nonprofit sector, especially grant funded positions and others, they have in government positions have a very defined range. And there's not a lot of wiggle room. So again, you want to take that into account and not always come in guns blazing. I'm going to negotiate no matter what. You know, you have to, you know your sector. But it is usually worth trying at least, you know, this question. I was looking for closer to 90,000. Is that a possibility? And that's what I was said at the beginning about this doesn't always have to be super complicated. That's a pretty simple question. And one of the key pieces of advice out there is once you ask that simple question to stop talking and let them answer it. And they will either say, yes, that's a possibility, and they can raise it right there, or they sometimes have to check. They might say no, they might say maybe, but it's always, I think, even in a tight situation, even when it's an entry level position, even if it's a nonprofit, you know, it can be worth, you know, trying. And I've worked with quite a few alumni entering, you know, in the nonprofit where, you know, there was a strong feeling that they didn't have a ton of money, and it ended up being only 1,000 more or 2,000 more than they asked for. But you know, every bit counts, especially when it's not a high salary to begin with. So it can be worth that. And then another important thing, something we work really hard with our students and seniors and recent grads on, but I think it applies to everybody, is sometimes, especially if you're very excited about the job, the tendency is to say yes right away. Like if you get the offer on the phone, to say yes right away. But the key thing we try and coach is be excited, say how excited you are to be offered the job, but don't say yes until you've talked about what's coming next. Very often when you get an offer over the phone, they might say salary, they might say a couple other things, but what you want is details. It's fine to ask for a written offer. You won't always get it. Sometimes they'll say we don't do written offers, but then at that point, either in that conversation or in a future conversation, you want to get details about, you know, everything that's being offered, not just the salary, but the benefits, the number of days off, etc. And then if they aren't providing a written offer, you can at least write it down in an email and say, from our conversation, here's what I heard. Just want to make sure that's correct. And again, it's not a binding legal contract, but at least it's an electronic, you know, or written trail of the information. So, and then once you've gotten the sometimes it's the verbal offer, sometimes you can wait till you get the written offer. You know, it's fairly common to ask for an additional 1 to 2 days to look it over and get back to them. And that's a good time to do more research and circle back to some of your contacts with that information. And then it's also a great time to reach out to us and sort of say, hey, here's what I'm being offered. What do you think? Okay, couple things. just don't keep going round and round. If it usually becomes clear after a while if things are going to move towards a middle ground or move higher, move lower than you would like. So don't keep going back and forth, back and forth. But I'd say generally, typical negotiation that I've worked with alums on has been, 1 or 2 rounds only. And then if it becomes clear you're not going to get as much as you want, you need to be able to concede gracefully. If you really can't, if it falls below your walk away point, then hard as it is, don't take the job. And we can talk that through with you as well. But another thing to keep in mind, and sometimes if they have to turn you down on salary, and sometimes they quite regretfully have to turn you down on it, maybe the manager went and made the appeal to the higher ups and they said no. And so the manager is like, oh, I'm sorry, but we can't go up any higher. That puts you in a good position to ask about some of these other things. We associate things, for instance, like a signing or performance bonus with, some of your higher paid private sector jobs. It is more typical there, but it's also possible in other types of organizations, various other sectors, right? So anything on this list is something that you could bring up. I would not bring up all of them, but sort of prioritize. So for instance, if start date is really important to you and they've just said, nope, we can't give you any more money, then that can be a good time to say, okay, still interested in the job. And you mentioned starting in, on August 1st, but, it would actually be better for me to start August 15th or September 1st. So you can, sort of use that little bit of leverage to get something else that's important to you. All right. So finally, after you've negotiated and accepted the offer, I want to take just a little look at future opportunities, right? So once you're actually in the job, you're going to have a lot more information. You're going to have, you've got human resources potentially, and at a smaller place, you're a manager. And you want to make sure you understand, what's the process, what's the timeline for raises and bonuses, and if those are tied to performance review schedule and process. Not every place has that. Smaller organizations, startups, et cetera, may not have a set process, but it's worth asking about and getting information about. And then once you're working someplace, there is an opportunity to gather information from your colleagues. It is illegal to ban it, but it doesn't mean it's always encouraged either. So you need to, be discreet. And again, I'll call out what we talked about earlier, which is, general discomfort around talking around money, and people may not be into that. But the flip side of that is that knowledge is power, and part of why salaries can remain unequal is because people don't talk about it, and don't share information with each other. So it's worth sort of pushing back on that culture and challenging that a little bit. And again, the third point gives you some other things that you can be asking for and finding out about. Right. So, and again, a lot of these things come from different lines, right? So in many companies and organizations, they have budget lines specifically for salary, but a lot of these other things like equipment, professional development, things like that come from a separate budget line. And so very often it's a perk that you can ask for and take advantage of, that can help you, something like professional development can actually help build your case in the future, towards a higher salary or a new title. Okay. Lots and lots of people have never asked for a raise, and don't feel bad if you haven't, but it is a normal thing that people do. You can't ask for a raise a month into your job, generally speaking, or even 6 months into your job. You want to have been there for a little while. You want to keep looking at market value, and then you also obviously you have to be able to demonstrate a reason. Generally speaking, you usually have to demonstrate a reason for it. If you're the one, asking for the raise, you need to be able to back that up with something. It is really important to think about timing. So you want to not be asking your manager about it in the middle of a huge project or when they are clearly focused on, something else. On the other hand, some managers are super busy and there's never going to be a good time. So often scheduling in advance and saying, I would love to sit down in the next month to, talk about a raise or promotion, when would be good for you, and sort of be proactive trying to get that to happen. But it's also good to understand how this is generally done, so that you're not jumping over an existing process. So very often there's the performance review process, but the budget process can often be different, and often salaries are set during the budget process. And so then when it comes time for performance review, the budget for the coming year is already set and you're almost too late. So you want to understand how does this work, and make sure you time it properly. And many places do have a set schedule for cost of living increases or merit raises, and you want to know what that process and timing is and be prepared for it. But this last bullet comes up a lot at smaller places, whether it's a nonprofit or a startup. At places where there's not a large, either no HR or a very small HR, a small and overwhelmed HR person or team. There could be a schedule that people ignore, or there could be no set schedule, but you don't have to wait. If you are, I officially empower you in those circumstances to take initiative and start the conversation. Okay. So general criteria, if a year is a good amount of time, and you feel like you've been doing a really great job, all right, you want to revisit your salary and do again some of the some of the things we talked about. All right, now you're on the inside, you might have joined a professional association or been part of other types of groups within your company, within your industry. You obviously have access to the people you work with, and maybe some connections out in the outer field. And then you've got the ability to, look over your specific work for, now you have a track record with the company. Instead of being brand new, you've got a track record, right? You do want to have given a little thought about what your number is, what title you're thinking about. And then the last point is, it's not really, it may for you be about your personal finances, but that's generally not the strongest argument to come with. You want to focus on it as a business case, not a personal case. Okay. All right. And so let's say you've been there a year or two, and you have this conversation, you make the ask. If they answer yes, great. If it's maybe, ask for the next steps. You don't have to ask in that moment, although you can, but keep an eye on it. There is a tendency around issues like this for, either your manager or the people above her to take a long time. And so it's okay to circle back after a week or 2 weeks or a month and say, hey, what's happening with this? And is there a timeline here? And then if you do get turned down, it's always good to ask that question. You could ask it in the moment, or you could ask it shortly afterwards. What can you do? And so sometimes they're going to give you a specific reason based on your performance. More often they're going to give you an organizational reason, but you just want to make sure you keep the dialogue open. So ask what you could do. All right, so some summary thoughts. I think my favorite line here on the slide is, be confident, or at least ask confidently. As we said at the beginning, this causes a lot of anxiety. It's an underused skill set for most people, because it's not that we don't negotiate, in a variety of forms, but this kind of formal negotiation around money, around salary, is a lot of people don't have a lot of experience in it, and it's okay for it to be new. It's okay to be nervous about it, but you want to, hopefully, from what we've talked about today, feel a little bit more confident, feel a little bit more like, this is something people do, this is something I can try. And you may not feel super comfortable, but this is an area where you want to push yourself outside of your comfort zone a little bit. These are sort of older but landmark books. These titles, I like these two titles. The Linda Babcock and Sarah Lashover, the authors, started out there with Women Don't Ask the High Cost of Avoiding Negotiation. They were two of the earlier researchers on women's reluctance to negotiate and data on how that hurts you over the course of your career. And then their follow-up was to how you can use the power of negotiation. So it was sort of like, here's the problem, and then here's the solution. So I always like that juxtaposition, even though there are more recent books, tons of articles, there's a lot of information out there. So, but I think the concept is a worthwhile one. There are a lot of resources. I did a quick, when you do a quick Google on this, women in negotiating, a lot of things pop up. I just wanted to highlight a couple that I knew about personally and maybe fly a little under the radar. The American Association of University Women, it's a higher ed professional organization, but they have a lot of materials and resources on negotiating generally, a lot of it targeted at students at the undergraduate and graduate level, but they've got, when I took a quick look this morning to see what was latest from them, they've got some free webinars, they've got various resources, so anybody can take a look at it. There's a relatively small organization here in New York called the WIN Summit, Women in Negotiation Summit. They hold a conference and they have a lot of other interesting material on their website around negotiating. And then this site that I've mentioned a couple times through the series, Ask a Manager. If you go to salary, there's a lot of good people sort of report, tell their stories, as well as asking their questions. She also has started doing an annual salary aggregator where she basically asks all of the readers, and there are many, to share their salary information, and then it's put into one of the readers is put it into a accessible Excel. You can a sortable Excel sheet. Yeah, it's probably so just again an interesting resource for sort of finding out about salaries, and you might find some good points of comparison in there. Okay, so from here, after this, we have only got one session. It's sort of the companion piece to this part, which is growing your worth, which is at this end of this process. If you've got a new position, how can you, while you're adjusting to your new job, begin, also keep in mind future steps either within the organization or outside of the organization. But after this long process or short process of finding a job, how can you keep some of these things we've been talking about top of mind? A handful of you have been making advising appointments, and you certainly can now or after the series ends. If you're familiar with Handshake, there's the link. If you're not, you can email Beyond Barnard, and Claire and a couple of my other colleagues can help you get signed up and get an appointment. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. We've got a few minutes left for questions, and let's see. Let me bring up the chat and see. Sorry, I'm laughing at a message someone sent privately that the wall behind me appears to be the same color as the slide background. It's actually, it's not a coincidence. We have sort of Beyond Barnard colors, right? So we use this particular shade of blue in our state, and then we all were given the choice. If you were here long ago, the wall behind me used to be bright orange, and when we repainted a couple years ago, we were given the choice of this blue or gray, a really pretty gray. So anyway, that's a little off topic, but I heard that labor laws have changed and that they can't ask you about salary during interviews. Yeah, it's a state by state thing. As far as I know, there's been no federal ruling on this. So depending on the state you're in, there are laws prohibiting that. So that's good, helpful point. Yeah, Massachusetts, I think, might have been the first. I feel like Massachusetts was the first to put that in action. Asking salary history is prohibited, and I know New York has, it'll be sort of the typical map, the Northeast and some of the, probably California and those areas where, blue states as opposed to red states. Any other questions? I threw a lot of information at you, but happy to field any specific questions anybody has, or general questions or thoughts. Okay, a comment that came, okay, Claire is passing on something. My understanding is that naming a number at the beginning is a way employers filter out applicants. Yeah, that's interesting. That's definitely part, I do think from the employer point of view, if you look at it from, you can interpret it benignly. They're just trying to filter out people who are looking for too high a salary, right? And that can happen, where people really, you know, sometimes it happens when somebody's, for instance, transitioning from the private sector to the nonprofit sector, and they either don't realize or don't want to accept the fact that nonprofit salaries tend to be lower, and so they overshoot. So I do think that is sometimes the case, that if you way overshoot the typical range, either on purpose or because you don't know, that can eliminate you. We've been hiring for a couple of roles here at Barnard, and we've had the discussion. We've definitely had, Barnard HR does ask that question, and we definitely look at it. If somebody overshoots a little, depending on the rest of what we're seeing from their resume and stuff, we often will still consider them if they're a strong candidate. But if somebody is I'm talking like, if somebody's like 20,000 above where we're paying, and if we look at the resume and sort of see that their experience level is probably too high for the position, then that often will be. So we don't screen based on number alone. I can't say that other employers don't do that. Yeah, so I think that I think it can factor in, and different employers use that information differently. Yeah, so again, that's where the advice comes from. And we had plenty of, it was interesting this last round of hiring. I noticed that on Barnard's application, we do accept text, and a lot of people just write in negotiable or flexible, right? And that's fine as well. If it's a strong candidate, we're going to bring them in, and, probably at the end of a first round, say, you didn't indicate a salary range. We want to let you know that this is the salary range. So if that's too low for you, we should, stop this now. Because it is true that if somebody has salary expectations way above what they're going to do, that it's usually not worth going through the whole interview process. So that can be where that comes from. So any other questions for the group? Any other experiences you want to share? All right, well, thank you very much. Small but mighty group. The numbers are falling off a little as the summer goes on, but we are also seeing a lot of people, clicking in and watching the recordings. So we'll wrap things up next week. I look forward to seeing any of you who are able to come back, and anybody who wants to follow up individually with myself or other members of our advising team, we welcome you to do that as well. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a good week.